Welcome to the Chess Angle. This is not your typical chess podcast. If you're an amateur or club-level player, the Chess Angle is for you. Our content is aimed at busy adults who are serious about the game but have limited study time. Featured guests include both amateur and titled players alike. And now, here's your host, Director of the Long Island Chess Club, Neil Bellon.
Welcome, everybody. My guest this week is Andy Ansel. He was referred by Brian Caron, who is a friend of the podcast and a former guest. Andy is a fellow amateur player and enthusiast. He learned to play in 1972 during the Fischer boom. He has a USCF peak rating of about 2100. He stopped tournament play around the year 2000. He's played against 3 world champions. We'll talk about that. And the bulk of our conversation will focus on Andy's extensive book collection, which is well north of 15,000 books. So Andy, great to have you. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
So you have a story you mentioned in the pre-interview. You didn't tell me this story, but you said you had a little bit of a story about our mutual friend, Brian Caron. So maybe we can start off with that.
So sure. So I've known Brian for many years. And so I basically lived in Long Island, moved to California and came back. And so when I was living in Long Island the first time, Brian came over and visited my house and he'd heard about my big collection. And, he was all excited to see it. And so he came into the house. I had him in the basement. He was looking around. And after he told me, he goes, I looked at this collection. I wasn't that impressed. I'm looking at this. It's not that big. And he said, okay, Brian, now that you've looked at my duplicates, let's go upstairs and see my collection. And and to put in perspective, my collection was probably about 30% or 40% of what I have right now, since I bought a lot more. But he said after that he realized I was in a whole different ballgame. So that was kind of my Brian story. He still tells that today.
Right. Yeah. Brian's like the mayor, like everybody knows Brian. Now, for those of you listening at home, Brian runs the Chess Book Collectors Facebook page, which has something like 50,000. It might even be more than that now, but we'll put a link for it. It's a pretty dedicated group of chess enthusiasts. So if you're into chess books, I encourage you to join that group. So Andy, let's talk about your playing background. I know you started in the Bay Area. For those of you internationally, that's San Francisco Bay area in California around 1973. So I was hoping you could tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. So, I learned during the Fischer boom, and, there were several clubs at the time that I belonged, such as the Mechanics Institute, the Oakland Chess Club, the Berkeley Chess Club. And there was one called in San Leandro, which is a neighboring town, called Captain Anchovy Pizza. And we played at a pizza parlor. And so I grew up playing as much as I could, played for my high school team. There was, people may remember the Whitehead brothers. They were my contemporaries of mine. Yasser Seirawan would come down from Seattle and play some of the Berkeley tournaments. And I tried to play weekly, at these events and play in the People's, which is a tournament in Berkeley. We'd go down to the Lira tournaments, which was played in Lockheed Martin results. So I started to play quite a bit and get quite active. And I really just enjoyed it. And I could argue that my game and book collecting started then because a local Bay Area legend called Max Burkett, or Motorcycle Max, who, for those who know him, who is a 2,200 plus player. And what he used to do is he would get bulletins. He would get game scores and make bulletins in an old Mimeo of these events back then. And what I would do is I'd help him go around, who's going to yell at a little kid, but they go around and grab all the score sheets. So I grabbed all the score sheets for him. That's kind of how, he helped preserve a lot of these games that, I played quite actively. I'd go down to the American Open. And as I say, we played a lot of strong players. There was a couple masters that were around. Craig Marr played a lot. We played his father, Henry. So it was a lot of fun, and it was kind of like the the old days where you kind of drive around with friends or parents. And so I played quite a bit through high school, and I played a little bit in college. I went to UCLA. The Pan Am, or the intercollegiates, were at USC one year, and I played on the UCLA C team. And then I played in a couple tournaments in LA. Actually, I saw John Donaldson, a friend of mine. I played one tournament where I played 2 very strong players. I played David Strauss, who I believe is an IM. And I played Julius Lofson, who I believe is a senior master. I don't remember who I beat, but I must have done okay because I lost to those 2 players. But around 1980, 81, I kind of quit. Decided to finish up school, take it a little more seriously, and pursue my career. And I would say I started playing again in the late 80s. I started taking lessons from Roman Zingishvili, who kind of taught a lot of people in the New York, Wall Street area. And I played quite a bit, not really quite a bit, but I played around at Manhattan, played at the Marshall. Found it very hard to play after a day at work. It's really exhausting. But I played in some events in Chicago. I like to go down to Bermuda. In the early 90s, I had the tournament of my life in Bermuda in 1991, where I beat a FIDE master named Simon LeBlanc. Game was published in a Swiss magazine, Shakwaukee, where they misspelled my name, called me Andy Arcel. I lost to Andy Soltis, and then I beat Joel Johnson, who's a 2400 player. And then I lost to Charles Hertan in the last round in one of the most disappointing games, having been exhausted. It was I was beating him, I think. It was a rook and 2 pawns versus a rook and 1 pawn. I had the 2, he had 1. But I got very confused of which way the board was going, and I actually hung my rook. And that ended a great tournament. And but that was kind of like the peak of my career. I think I had a FIDE performance rating, and it was only 4 games of like 2,300. And then, as I say, I played a little bit on and off, had kids in 94, and just kind of life took over. And now I really just, I like to study, play a little bit online through ICC, and I play correspondence chess on ICCF, which you're allowed to use computers, and kind of use that to fine tune my skills and learn openings.
Yeah, I like what you said about the rooks. Like you forgot which way you're going in the in the end game there. I think we can all relate to that. I think we've all been there at some point.
Well, I'll tell you something a little bit more embarrassing about that if you want to know. So Joel Johnson wrote an article about this event in Chess Horizons and commented, about the great tournament I had, except for my blunder in the last round, showed the position I hung the rook, and kind of highlighted the fact that if I'd won that game, I would have gotten a free trip to Bermuda the next year. So my blunder was published in Chess Horizons, but once is not enough. Charles Hertan responded in the next issue and said, it really wasn't a lost ending, it was a drawn ending, and showed the same position the second month. So for 2 months in a row, my blunder was shown in Chess Horizons, which is the New England chess magazine.
Yeah, no, it happens. We had something similar, just as a side note, at the club, where the players were sort of lining up their rooks on a file, because that happens in the end game, right? Or like late middle game is you end up just trading down. But what happened was one of the players puts his rook there, the other player puts a pawn to attack his rook, and he was so eager to double his rooks, he moved the other rook behind it, not realizing that his opponent just attacked his other rook, because he's like, all right, my plan is to double rook. So he moves the one rook from let's say E1 to E6. The opponent pushes the pawn attacking it, and then he just almost reflexively puts his other rook behind it. Okay, it happens. These things happen, these oversights. But I want to ask you about the correspondence chess, Andy, because I know next to nothing about it. And I was actually going to ask you about computers, because my thinking is, as someone who doesn't know about it, like correspondence chess, like how is that a thing? Everybody just uses computers, but you're telling me that that's allowed. So can you maybe tell me and the audience, many people may not know a lot about correspondence chess, like how does that work exactly? And how does that work with computers being allowed?
So the ICCF, which basically made a rule that we can't tell if you're cheating or not, so we'll just allow computers. So the idea being is that if you look at chess.com or others, LIChess, in these correspondence games, a lot of people do use computers and are accused of cheating. And ICCF said, we can't tell if you're doing that, so let's just allow it. It definitely changes the complexity of the game in a lot of ways. So first of all, let's just assume that you're using Stockfish 16 or another corresponding engine. So me playing you with an engine, you're saying engine versus engine, who's going to win? The games are all going to be drawn. And I would say that is a high propensity that, roughly about 80%. I think I looked up 80% of my games I played on ICCF. I think I played around 200 games and I've won 40 of them. So, 80% of the games are drawn. But what's interesting is your opening play is much more exacting. So, for example, I'm a very attacking style player, like to play a lot of gambits. And so, for example, I play the wing gambit against the French, E4, E6, knight F3. And then I play, when they play D5, I play E5, C5, B4. So that's kind of the opening that I play. And I used to play that in correspondence chess. You can't play that against computers because you will lose. I mean, it's technically unsound. And, a lot of other openings are very tough to play. And so you really have to fine tune your openings. And what I found is that, after 20 or 25 moves, if the position is dead equal, unless you have a blunder of an oversight of a typo of a machine error or something like that, the games are probably going to be drawn. But you can still win by smart opening play. Like I looked at a game, I won a game, and it was basically a 2 knights defense. And, you look at openings. And the other thing that's interesting is that, there are certain lines that just computer people play a lot more than over the board people. And so the opening play is much more important. The strategy of the opening, John Edwards, who's the recently won the world championship and is a grandmaster in correspondence chess, like he'll tell you, in his opinion, certain openings are drawn by force. Now, obviously, that's his level using multiple computers and all that, but the opening choice is hard. And, I look at that. So what I'll do a lot of times is I'll take a book that I bought, Coffee House Repertoire by Wayne Jones. There's 2 volumes of that. So I'll play his repertoire and I'll use that against, I pick a book like that and I'll use that against an opponent. Like if I were playing you, I'd follow his lines and see how they are. And obviously I check them with computers and I use that to kind of fine tune book analysis and make sure things aren't missing. And there are certain lines, as I say, like, there's a big debate in the King's Gambit whether bishop c4, the bishop gambit is sound or not. And John Shaw wrote a monumental book on the King's Gambit, and Tim Taylor wrote his own book where Tim Taylor recommends the Fisher, they call it the Fisher Gambit of the bishop c4, and John Shaw basically said it's refuted by force, and at best case it's a draw. I can tell you, having played I think 3 or 4 games with it against computers, it may be a draw for white, but it's not a lot of fun. Boy, do I sweat. It's like 60 or 70 moves of playing the exact stuff. So you kind of are testing your opening play, you're learning stuff. The other thing that's very interesting that I've learned is you learn a lot about engines. So for example, again, let's just use computer lingo and say you're up 4 points, which is better than a piece. You'd say, okay, if I'm up 4 points by you, I should win. But a lot of times the computers has you maneuvering in closed positions and you can't figure out a way to break. So what happens is I've had several games where I was up by these 4 points. I said, how do I, convert this advantage? So sometimes you have to play a suboptimal move to change a structure. And so, it's not just looking at a computer. It's like, well, I can't see a breakthrough here, but, maybe I'll do moves that makes me from up 4 to up 2, but which case, like a pawn will get doubled or a file will get opened or a piece will get exchanged. And then which case I can then take that advantage out. So it's using, you can't just let the computer play. You still have to play with it. So I look at it as an educational thing. It's great to play when you're at work. It's, as I say, it's great to test out new openings. You test out openings in blitz play to get a feel for it. But this gets real deep. And the other thing that's very interesting, so if you look at these top grandmasters now, the ICCF comes out with a database of all games played each month. And so if you remember, you get to do that. And that database is probably a better opening database and a more exact database than ChessBase or the Week in Chess. It's really ones like, so if you look at like, Anish Giri has written or produced some courses on Chessable, he actually quotes computer games more than anything else because they're trying these lines. So it really becomes more exacting a little bit. And it's tough, but you do have to be, it's a little frustrating because, as I say, a lot of games are drawn.
No, that's interesting. I didn't realize the level of correspondence chess, how intense that gets, but I had no idea the computers were allowed. I honestly had no idea because that's just not, correspondence is just not something that I got into, but very cool. So I definitely want to get to this. You played 3 world champions, right? Symslov, Tal, and Kasparov. I know you played them, I believe, in simul's, but I would love to hear what those experiences were like.
So, so I did play them. So they were all over a course of many years. So Symslov I played when I was a kid, I guess a teenager at the San Francisco Mechanics Institute in the 70s. And I don't think, first of all, back then a grandmaster was much rarer than now, more of a novelty. I mean, I think people underestimate the skill level for a grandmaster and don't appreciate how really strong and great these players are. And so, Symslov, I just remember as a very gentlemanly guy. He carried himself very well, dressed very well. He didn't really speak a whole lot, and and it was just a very, I would say, a little intimidating. Just because you're playing a world champion, and he was. I just remember being very tall, dressed in a suit, and he was going really quickly. And I would say that the rule is that when he gets your board, you have to move, and a lot of times you're not ready for that. I think that I wasn't real prepared, and I lost pretty quickly to him. But I remember it was kind of a fun experience, and it was very neat. And so that was when I was a kid, and then. As I mentioned, I started playing again in the late 80s when I was moved to New York and my professional career before kids. And Tal gave us simul at the Manhattan Chess Club, your old one above Carnegie Deli, Carnegie Hall across from Carnegie Deli. And Tal has always been one of my idols, attacking player. And the thing about Tal is, what are you going to play against him, and how are you going to last? And to say that I may have been the first person to lose, if not, I was very quick. But he opened up the game, And again, you're like, oh my God. I would just say that him at his level, I was probably more in awe of him, and I was like, oh my God, this is tall I'm playing, and focused on that more than the game. And again, I was just butchered real quickly, and but it was a great experience. And he had, while Symslov was more reserved and more looked a little bit more, I don't want to say the term professional, but a little bit more like a major player. Tall was kind of quick and kind of herky jerky and had a lot of kinetic energy around him. And you could just see, you could see how, the story was I think Benko once put sunglasses on when he was playing Tall because he didn't want to get hypnotized. You can see him wanting to do that because there was that, oh my God, this is Mikhail Tal. And then in, I think it was 2005 or 2006, Kasparov gave a charity event in the New York Athletic Club. And I'd stopped playing, I think around 2000 or 2001, but I thought it'd be a really neat experience to play Kasparov. And he played, I think it was, I think it may have been 20 people. And, you think that, 20 people is a lot, but for these guys, it's not. And, the thing was also, since it's a charity event, some of these people were not very good. And again, when he moved, you had to move quickly. And the thing about Kasparov, I think he was a combination of Symslov and Tal. He had that charisma, energy, and but at the same time, he had that professional, that very strong charisma and demeanor of wanting to be out there. And so I knew what opening I was going to play. And of course, he changed it around. I was going to play against the Roy Lopez, and he played an Italian game against me. I really didn't know what I was doing. And, I'll never forget, he sat down with hands on, he sat at my table with basically his chin in both hands and looked at me and stared. And it's one of the most intimidating, scary, like you almost felt like you were being mugged at a chessboard, like the concentration level. And then he made a move. And then what happened was people started losing. And I think my game was okay, but I'm sitting there looking at a move. Okay, I want to move this move. I want to move this. Oh my God, this move isn't good. All of a sudden he's at my board and I had to make another move right away. And I made a move and I lost quickly. And it was funny because Michael Rode, who's also a grandmaster, was at the exhibit. And after I lost, he said, you were okay at this point if you just played this move instead of the other one I had, but I didn't have time to think. But I would say, Kasparov afterward was incredibly charming, very nice. He was just a really nice person. And I would say that, we had dinner with him. So I would say we got to interact with him more than Tal or Symslov, because those were just the games. But I would say each was different. But I would say Symslov was just very kind of reminded you of just a elderly professional person. Tal had the kinetic energy, and Kasparov was a combination of both, where he had the charisma. But oh my God, when he got that, I have a picture that my daughter who was there took of him looking at that, and you're still a little nervous looking at him staring at the board. It's just kind of a funny experience. But it was a great experience, and I highly recommend people play in those, even if not a world champion. It's kind of a nice experience, and it kind of gives you a lot of fun. And I think that it's a kind of an underestimated way of enjoying chess at a high level, even if you're not a super strong player.
Yeah, no, they're fun. The last one I was at was Maurice Ashley was at a mall here on Long Island, and it was really cool. He gave his lecture, and then he pretty much blew everybody off the board. But it's a great social experience. But like you said, if you can play in it, it's certainly fantastic. So let's make a little bit of a right turn from your playing background to your book collection. So this episode is for all the chess book lovers out there, because Andy's collection is north of 15,000 books, which I can't even process. Now, before we get to the books, like, where do you have them stored? Like, do you have like a basement devoted to it? And like, how is your wife with all this? Just is she kind of like rolling her eyes with this, or is she kind of dealing with it? Like, I'm just curious, like, where are you storing all of these? So
first of all, I think your comment is great. I don't think people can't comprehend how many books I have. Like, as many as you think I have until you go there. So we lived in Syosset until about 3 or 4 years ago, and in my house I had 2 libraries. I had over a 3-car garage. I had a library of books, and in the basement I actually built like stacks, like a library. So they were not only against the walls, but all sorts of stuff. And then I had stuff in boxes and all over. And we quote downsized when we moved out to further east of Long Island. And so right now I have books pretty much everywhere. I have in my office, I have a small shelf that probably has a couple hundred books. In the main room, there was a built-in shelf that has filled with books. In my wife's office, there was a built-in shelf. I have those filled with books. I have a basement that's probably close to 2,000 square feet, of which one room is very big, which I had shelves built all around. That's filled with books. I had 2 other areas of shelves built, and then I probably have still multiple hundreds of boxes in various rooms in the basement. So the basement is really 2 bedrooms, which are filled with books, like my library, which is filled with books as boxes. And then I have for lack of a better word, they were going to build a wine cellar that was never finished. So that's stacked with books. So it is literally like, one of the things that's very frustrating is I haven't unpacked them all. I've labeled many of them because in my other house I had more room. So I'm still trying to figure out where I want to put stuff and how I want to do stuff. But I think that, it is very funny because I don't think that people can appreciate, I would argue that outside of opening and beginner and a few endgame books, I pretty much had every book that you can imagine published since 1851. Like there are very few books that I ever had that I didn't want. Like there's, I went earlier than 1851, and I can tell you a little bit about that. When people thought I should enrich my collection and buy a couple of Philidors or Roy Lopez's and Grecos, but I really don't get much enjoyment out of them. I like games and tournaments, but I pretty much have, they're very few. So in my move, I did quote try and downsize. So I sold a few things to people, but of course since then. I bought several collections. I got a lot of stuff from Dale Brandreth's collection. John Donaldson. I helped work with a guy named Bob Moore, who's a big collector from Alaska and San Francisco. So stuff that I got rid of, I re-got, and I have more stuff that I know what to do with. But it's a little overwhelming and daunting at times. In terms of my wife, she's awesome. She understands it. Again, you could argue it's a better hobby than golf because you're at home. And what I've done is I kind of established a checking account that's my chess account that I manage when I buy and sell and do stuff. And so, because I do get rid of duplicates. I buy books on wholesale and sell to friends of mine at basically a break even. So, like I buy new books at roughly 40% off for the most part. So it helps it that way. And it just it goes, but it's it's like a lot of times what I'll do is I have an hour to kill. I'll just go down, open up a box. Oh, I haven't seen this for a while, or I'll play around the shelf and try and know where it is. I guess the big weakness I have is I don't have them cataloged, and that is a big weakness. And I recognize that. I tried to do it for a while, but it became overwhelming. And people who catalog stuff, it's almost a full-time job. But it is as I say, at some point, if you ever come out east, you can come look at it. And I think you'll be like, oh my God, is he crazy? I probably am.
No, that's awesome. And there's something about just the whole, tactile experience of actually holding a book. It reminds me back in the day, like when you actually listened to records, like this. You would hold the album cover, look at the lyrics, and now everything is just you press a button on your phone, right? It's just not the same as looking something online, right? I assume you like that whole tactile experience of actually holding the book, right?
Yeah, I think it's a good analogy. I mean, again, I am switching slightly to using some stuff online to help study. Chessable's a thing I use, but like what I'll do is like I have you can't see behind me, but I have a couple books. I'll just think, a little hour I just want to read or look at. Yesterday I was looking at a Lasker book at night. So I do like reading it and looking at it. Obviously my eyesight is probably, as most people who get older, is some of these things are a little struggling. But most of these books are pretty readable. The newer books have good print. And so I like reading books. I mean, I'm really, I love chess history. And as I say, I'm really a post-1851 guy. But like, Ruby and Elk's done a lot of nice books on the Soviet championship histories, which I love reading about. Them and Quality Chess have come out with some of these Soviet masters, that you've read about in Russian. And I have all these books in Russian, which I can't read, but reading them in English. And it is, to spend 20 or 30 minutes reading through a magazine, Old New in Chess or a chess review, I really enjoy that. It is a tactile experience. But again, it just brings a little smile to my face, and it kind of brings back, the history of chess, which I find so fascinating.
Now, you started your collection, correct me if I'm wrong, you bought the Manhattan Chess Club collection. You mentioned that a little bit, but like, how did that go down? Like in the mid 90s, you sort of bought their whole collection? Right.
So what happened was, I would say when I was playing before that, I had a couple, I would call myself a casual book collector. I had the Dover books and all that. And so I would say a good friend of mine and mentor who probably has the premier collection in the United States, a guy named David DeLucia, who's also in the Wall Street world. We were talking, and the Manhattan Chess Club, these chess clubs don't know what to do with books, because what happens is, unfortunately, members tend to walk away with them. Storing them is hard. I mean, the Manhattan, as you know, has gone to multiple places and moving them and packing them, conditions. And so what happened was they had some Capablanca letters and memorabilia from Mrs. Capablanca and books. And it wasn't, it was what they call their collection, and they wanted to sell them. And they were looking for a certain amount of money, and they wanted to sell them together or separately. And David did not want the books, but wanted the Kappa stuff. And we worked out a deal where he would buy one. We gave a price of all of them, and he'd pay for his part and I'd pay for my part. And believe it or not, we were bidding against the Polgar's father. And so we got a lot of books. So I went to the Manhattan. I looked at the books. A lot of the books were not in good condition. A lot of them needed rebinding. A lot of them were unclear. But interesting, a lot of them were signed by Kamak, who was a writer for Chess Review, a very famous chess writer, author of Pawn, Power, and Chess. There's other items, and so we put together a deal. So the club obviously needs money. This was not getting much use, and these were not new books. These were old books, like old BCMs, etc. And I bought them, and we gave them. I think our total price, and again, I'm maybe off on this. It was between $10,000 and $12,000, and I think Polgar's bid was $7,500. And again, I think I paid $5,000 for my books. But the irony is one of the books I bought was a very rare book on the automaton, and noted chess book dealer Dale Brandreth had a big interest in that. So he offered me $2,500 in credit for books from him for this one book. So I paid $5,000 for a collection, and I got half of it back on one book. Now I probably spent several $1,000s rebinding books because they had all the old BCMs from Volume 1, which is quite rare, and other stuff. So I had them rebound. But that was kind of like my book collecting start. And I kind of realized that I like this stuff. And then the Mechanics Institute in San Francisco, which is kind of where I started playing, they have a library. It's a mechanics library more than just chess, but they also had a lot of bulletins and stuff that people had given. And so, I knew the person who was running the chess room at the time. It may have been John Donaldson, or he may have been involved, but Mark Pinto was involved. And they said, listen, we put these out and people are just taking them. We know that you were interested. What price would you pay for them? So I gave them a price of, I think it was $3,000. And I got 10 things of bulletins. And they were real happy because they got money. And I was real happy. I got a lot of stuff. And then the other big collection is Bob Wade, who's who worked for Batsford and did all the opening books in the 70s, the Batsford opening books. He also had a very large bulletin collection. And when he passed away, there was an auction. And it was a weird auction. What they did is they took him and broke him down by years. So I was in California, and the auction was in London. And so like at 3:30 or 4 o'clock in the morning, I got up to bid. And I was bidding on all these boxes. And so, I bought a ton of his boxes. I bought about 80% of the bulletins he was selling. The problem was that I figured out how to get them from London to the United States. And they actually did a cargo shipment where they put it on a plane. It went to San Francisco Airport, and I picked them up at San Francisco Airport. But those were kind of my bigger collections. I had a couple other things that were interesting. There was a person who for many years was offering out a bunch of old Russian material. And he was from the Ukraine. A lot of the, Alekhine did a magazine in the, I think, 1914, 15, 16, or 15, 16, 17. A lot of old Russian books, a lot of bulletins, a lot of very rare stuff. But the condition was he would not ship you the books until you paid him first. And no one wanted to do that. And I decided, I'll take the chance. And I sent him the money. And that was a bonanza. It worked out well. I got a lot of, Russian magazines from the 1890s. And stuff like that. So part of it was luck and taking a chance. I also worked quite closely with a chess book dealer, Fred Wilson, in the New York area. He and I have worked together on many deals where I'll buy a collection, and because a lot of the stuff he won't want, or we'll share it. And I remember we once went. It was literally right before I moved to California. I think it was in 2001. And it was one of the weirdest experiences. They were selling a house, and outside the house, in the backyard, there's almost like a tunnel in the dirt, like an underground cave. And inside there were a bunch of old books. And and it turns out there's a famous New York player named Edward DeMock. There's a DeMock themed tourney from the Marshall in the 20s, and I believe this may have been his collection because a lot of them were signed by him. And there were a lot of really rare books that were actually in good condition, considering they're in this dirt cellar. So kind of luck, word of mouth, and just working with, as I say, having a mentor. David DeLucia's taught me a lot, and Fred Wilson's taught me a lot about it. And one of the things I've always said, and it doesn't really applies to chess books as well as everything else, is don't collect for the money, collect because you love it, and try and learn what you will make mistakes. I'll pay too much for certain books. You'll get bargains, but it's a learning experience, and part of the fun is the experience of collecting.
Yeah, you have to enjoy it. That's the main thing. It's like you said, you have an hour to kill. You pick up a book, puts a smile on your face. That's great. Now, can we talk about some of your favorites, maybe some first or second editions? I know you have quite a few that can probably fit that category, but any particular favorite books, anything that you're kind of most proud of?
So yeah, so my favorite book of all time is Chess in Philadelphia, 1899 by Reichel. I only have 3 or 4 copies of it. I have a copy dedicated to Walter Shipley, who's a famous Philadelphia player. It's a beautiful leather book. The pages are old. The pictures are beautiful. Physically, it's one of the nicest books I've ever held. And every time at times I'll just go to the library and hold it like, oh my God, this is beautiful. I do have a second edition Roy Lopez, which is quite valuable. Don't really, it's a nice book. I have a first edition Philidor. I have some early Grecos. Another book that I have that's nice that you'll appreciate is I have a first edition, a Masters of this Chessboard by Reddy, which is not a super special book, but the person who had it before me went to Nottingham 1936 and had it signed by all participants that were playing there. So it's signed by 5 world champions. Let's see, Capablanca, Oiva, Botvinnik, Blasker. I'm seeing who else I'm forgetting. But the funny thing is, during the Casper Simul, I brought it to show it to Gary Kasparov and asked if he would sign it. And he goes, oh my God, I'd be honored to sign it. So I had Kasparov sign it as well. And so that's obviously has a special meaning to it. I have a couple other books that are not as well known that I like. Like my favorite tournament book's a book by Lone Pine, 1975, by the California Chess Reporter. And so Lone Pine was an event done in the early 70s to, I think, 71 to 81, where they had a lot of young American players play strong foreign players for norms and get experience. And the 1975 book was quite strong. Isaac Cashton was a tournament director. And the players were supposed to annotate either one or two of their favorite games. I believe that was the event where Kushner beat Larry Evans in the first round. How a woman can beat a grandmaster. That was this big scandal. But Jude Acers, who was one of my favorite players, annotated some of these games in detailed styles. And if you ever play against the Danish Gambit and want to learn about 3 Queen E7, it's almost like a book on his opening. So it's a very fun book to read. And I've always really enjoyed that book. I could say I've probably played through every game. I would argue that my 2 favorite players are probably Bobby Fischer and Alexander Alekhine. And so Fischer's 60 Memorable Games has a very special place in my heart. I've played through that book many, many times. And I've gone through, and for those of you that remember the old tartan paperbacks of Alekhine's best games, one's has a yellow on the spine, the other has a reddish color. I've played through that. I still have my original copies here, and they're pretty beat up. I've gone through that. So those are some of my favorites. The list can go on, but as I say, I really try and enjoy the books that I do that I like to play with. But I would say that not a question in my mind that the Philadelphia 1889 book by Chess in Philadelphia is by far and away my favorite book. And if you can ever go to a library, like whether it be the Mechanics or Princeton or any libraries, you can see an original copy and hold it. You'll appreciate it. As I say, it's an original leather-bound book, and it's just beautiful.
Yeah, a couple of follow-ups there. So first of all, usually I put a list of books referenced in the episode. I think I'm going to skip that in your case, Andy, because I don't know if there's room for 15,000 or whatever. So I think, we'll just take the conversation on its own and just go from there. Now, the other thing is, do you get a lot of people asking you if you want to sell? Because I assume you probably have a bit of a reputation like, oh, do you want to sell this? Or maybe not. I don't know. Maybe you don't. I'm just curious.
Per the story for Brian in the beginning, I probably have between 2,000 and 3,000 duplicates. And so I do so I have people I deal with on a regular basis. I occasionally on Brian's Facebook group you mentioned, I'll post items that I have in duplicate that I'll sell. One of the reasons I like doing this is, again, to be clear, it's not for the money and to maximize profit. I really like getting the books in people's hands, books that are out of print and things that are there. So I do sell. I do have people occasionally asking me for stuff. I try and help out. But I'm not. I would say, as I said to someone once, I said, as soon as this becomes a business for me, I stop doing it. I enjoy books, I enjoy collecting, I enjoy people I deal with. It's not a business, and as soon as it starts becoming a business and takes away my joy, I'll stop it. So the answer is, people do contact me. I have a pretty extensive duplicate collection. As I say, a lot of it's through the Brandreth items. Another funny story which I can tell you is I work for a Canadian bank, and I go to Canada about 10 to 15 times a year. And about a year ago, randomly, I was in Canada, and a good friend of mine, Ken McDonald, who's a noted collector, said, listen, do you still buy collections? I said, yeah. He goes, well, a friend of mine who I actually knew, Wayne Comer, passed away in Toronto, and his son doesn't know what to do. And I said, well, Ken, actually, I'm in Toronto now. Maybe I can see him this week. And because one of the things that I find is that dealers and other people really downbid these people. I want to give as fair a price as possible. And so I went to, I was on a business trip. I ended up buying about 20 boxes of books that I had to figure out how to ship from Toronto. But the answer is, yeah, I do sell stuff. But it's really more like, people can contact me, friends I know, or look for stuff. Or like I know, like I have a friend of mine who I know is collecting a certain thing. So if I find them, I'll say, hey, I got them for you. But it's not really a full scale business. It's more like on a friendly basis of people I deal with on a regular, communication.
Yeah, right. So you have like a nice circle of people and colleagues that you're comfortable with, that you just kind of deal with them.
Yes.
That makes sense. And then you have a little bit more control. You know where it's going. So let's jump to some of your writings. I know you've done some writing and you've written some articles. Maybe you could tell us about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think it's kind of ironic that I write for Chessbook, and I consider that my English skills are horrible. When I was in college, you need a certain score. I went to UCLA, and you had to score to qualify for English. Otherwise, you had to take something that we call bonehead English. I had to take that. But my wife is a professional writer, and so she helps me out a little bit. So I really started writing with Alexander Baburin's Chess Today newspaper and doing book reviews, and that was a lot of fun. That was a great newspaper at the time. Alex and his team did a great job, and Alex gave me a lot of freedom to write whatever I wanted. Because one of the challenges is you don't want to bash a book because it really can hurt a sale, but also at the same time you want to protect the buying public if you don't like it. And I remember there was a book that a GM wrote that that I gave kind of a negative review on, and the GM wrote to Alex, who published a letter, and said, listen, this reviewer doesn't know what he's talking about, blah blah blah. He's not the target audience. And I felt like saying, wait a second, a 2000 player not being the target audience of your book, what do you mean? Is it only for a 2400 player? So he let me have a lot of freedom, and that was a lot of fun, and I enjoyed that. And then I wrote for Bob Long. He did a magazine called Squares, and I did that a little bit more interesting. One of my favorite articles, actually, I should send you a link. Maybe, I don't know if you post it. I'll see if I think I have it. It's called The Lazy Researcher. And the idea was, it was I think it was a Lasker Steinitz World Championship. And there's a game that has multiple sources of moves. And so, I basically was implying that I'm just going to copy the moves over from like a newspaper, but there's like 4 different sources of moves for a world championship game. And so it was kind of a funny story. So I wrote some stuff for Bob that was a lot of fun, and Bob was easy to work with, really fun guy. And then I recently started doing a column or an article for the American Chess Magazine for my archives, because, we can talk about it later, but, I take pride in my database and my games, which I think is probably a premier American database. And I get a lot of stuff. And so I'm publishing games from people who that haven't been seen. They're not in any magazine. They're not anywhere else. And, there are, again, so what I do is I write the text, and Pete Tamburo, who I think is a fantastic annotator and writer, he does the games and edits them. So for me, it's pretty easy because I have, really quality people behind that. And, one of the things that I did recently is a good friend of mine, Jeremy Silman, who you probably have heard of, passed away. And I knew he was quite ill. And, as I say, I've known Jeremy since I was like 13 or 14 years old. He actually inscribed a book to me once and said, "Oh, how I wish it was your strength when I was 14. And I wanted to kind of get this out before he passed away. And I have Jeremy's database that he'd given me. And so we kind of published a little bit about Jeremy Silman. So I was very proud of that. I did something about recently, the magazine came out where Bill Martz, was a strong IM from Wisconsin, who passed away at a very young age. Dale Brandreth had I'm going to call it a notebook or scores of all 1,800 of Bill's games. I'm currently, my first article was on John Curto, who was probably one of the most active players in the New England area for many years. And I have all his score books. And so trying to bring unknown games to people and kind of make a personality about it. And that's been a really fun experience. Some of the people I'm thinking of doing next, I may do Bruce Albertson, who is a noted author from the New York area. And if you look at like ChessBase or chessgames.com, you'll see about 13 of his games. I have all his score books. And so I enjoy kind of bringing that to life and writing about the history of it. And so I find that a lot of fun. Though I will say, even though I know what I'm going to write, every time I start my article, I'm always scared to write it, if that makes sense. But it's still a lot of fun.
Now, you mentioned your database. That was actually my next question, where you have an extensive database collection from your bulletins. Like, can you tell me about that and how big it is and, what that's become?
So I can't tell you how big it is because I don't keep track. But first of all, a lot of the games. So I enter games in manually from bulletins, from scorebooks, from regional match. So one of the things that I do collect, and that I have probably the world's largest collection, is regional state magazines, and so that will probably go to Cleveland at some point in time when my career is over. But so I enter in from regional magazines. So I contribute chess base. So a lot of the American stuff goes there. So for example, the Lone Pine tournaments, all the bulletins, I entered all the games in there. And then what happened was so there were no bulletins for the 1971, 73, and 74 events. 73 and 74 were in someone's trunk when the car got stolen and they lost the score sheets. But with a lot of help from John Donaldson and others, we tracked down players. I got a bunch of score sheets, so I filled in those games. It started off actually, quite honestly, with the U.S. championships. Again, a lot of the U.S. championship games were not there, so I started working on that. There's an excellent service called BritBase run by John Sanders that covers British games. So I enter a lot of bulletins from him, give them to him. So really, I kind of say that I have a goal of entering between 10 and 15 games a day. So I kind of wake up early and do that. I'm not sure that's true. Like, one of the other people I'm doing right now is Ariel Mengarini, who's one of the most interesting players of all time. He started to play through the 30s, through the 90s, and he kind of invented 30 and 30 chess. He played very offbeat openings. John Hilbert has lent me his 2,000 plus score sheets. So I constantly go through and add these things. And U.S. Opens, I try and collect games, whether it be from the Spence booklets. So really, I would say that my quiet morning time is spent with a notebook or a book or a bulletin in front, entering in games. And as I say, some of it goes to ChessBase and Megabase. I donate them, I give them stuff. Some of it goes to Megabase. And we've talked to, one of the things I guess in my legacy at some point is I'd like to create an American base similar to BritBase, where we have like U.S. Opens, U.S. Championships. So I work with John Hartman, who's the editor of Chess Life. We've talked about this. It's not that simple to do, but I think that's really interesting. I think that the culture, American chess is really not well recorded on a relative basis. Obviously, with all the Swiss tournaments, I've gone through Horowitz's columns, Burns' columns, and entered in a lot of these games. But I think that, this is a legacy of people that, were very strong players that we don't know about, and I think that it's important to kind of save that and to electronify it. And, one of the things obviously is, as soon as you put it on one database source, it's now public available and everyone gets that. So you kind of struggle, like, is it mine? How much do I want to do? But I'm trying to share as much as I can and do stuff. And, I've been very helpful. So certain players have given me their files, like Jack Peters gave me all of his games from, I think, 71 to 75. Andy Soltis gave me a lot of his games. I think I have about 1,000 of Andy's games. I think he's starting to put them on chessgames.com, but he gave me those games. So people have given me a lot of stuff that way. And I've been kind of central warehouse. The other thing I'll help out is, if someone wants to, like, for example, if you're doing a research, a book, and you want to see an opening, or if you want to see a player games, I try and help out like stuff. So I'm trying to make it a little bit more readily available. But I would say that that's kind of my, while I love my book collecting and I enjoy that, I would say my database is kind of my baby, and I got to figure out what I'm going to do with it. Though it does take up a lot less room than 15,000 books.
So I want to do one more segment, Andy, if that's okay. I know you have some thoughts on older books, how people love older books, but more modern books may be better as far as instruction and learning. Some people may disagree, but I'm just wondering what your thoughts are as far as improving as a player, looking at the older books versus some of the more modern books.
That's a very interesting question. And if you look at Brian's Facebook page, when people say, what book do you recommend? You'll hear stuff like, oh, you got to read My System. I think that these books are classics and enjoyable, but nowadays, books are quite honestly a lot better quality. If I were to want to learn pawn structure, I don't think I'd go to My System. I'd probably read a Watson book or a Silman book about imbalance. If you want to go a little bit older, Andy Soltis' book on pawn structures. So I think that the modern books, if you pick the good ones, have a lot more detail to them. They built upon, just like, you can't compare Morphy's style to Kasparov's style, because obviously Kasparov has learned from all the past, and Kasparov is stronger than Morphy and Say, but if Morphy were playing today, he'd be different. It's kind of like the writers have learned from the Nimzoviches and the Kamaks, the Reinfelds. And so, if you're doing a tactic book now, why would you look at a tactic book from 1930 or 1940 when you can have some of these great new books now that have, newer games and more modern approaches? I'm struggling to I'm thinking, I love going over older games, and I was going through them. I was going through a recent book on Rubinstein, a fantastic book that just came out in English by Verandal Press. It's an English translation of a Russian book. And I'm like, these are great games, but people now defend so much better. So the style is different, the play is different. So I think that I think that people like to recommend what they learn from, but I think that the quality of a lot of these newer books are a lot better. And you can argue, like, if you want to look at a book on Boris Spassky, Cafferty wrote a really nice book at the time, by Batsford. But there's recently a book done. New in Chess published a book on Spassky, and I'm playing through this, and it's just, they're explaining the games and a lot more text and how I want to do it in today's day and age. They're using opening examples. So I think that the newer books tend to be probably more, I don't want to say better, but a little bit more realistic for playing today. And you can still love and play through the old books. I still do, as I say, I still go through old books, but I think the quality of the newer books are really good. And again, a lot of the stuff like the Ruby and Elk books and some of the quality chess books on Russian chess players, Soviet history, these were not available back then. And you can learn just so much more than like, some of the other books. And, if you think about that, if you go back to the real early days under Jack Spence or Fred Reinfeld or accordingly, they were able to take information that was not available and present that to us. Now we don't have that problem. The internet gives us our information. So the idea that a tournament in Russia, you could actually get the moves in the United States in the 20s and 30s was an idea. Like, no one had those games. The fact that you can get them 3 months later was considered modern. Now you and I can click on many websites and find out games that were played yesterday. And there is no barriers of language or games there. So I think that the information has changed and the quality has changed. And there's some really, really nice writers. I mean, you look at Timon, you look at Donaldson, you look at Soltis. Look at Silman, and the list can go on. Agard is fantastic. I mean, these writers really write good things. Not to downplay the old books, but I think that if someone said, I'm a beginner player and I want to learn, I would not give them my system. I'd give them, a more modern book. I think, and again, I'm more at odds to a lot of the people who on these Facebook pages and others who kind of go back to what they know. But I think that the modern books are more instructive and a little bit more realistic, and quite honestly, a little bit more readable.
Yeah, I agree. No, the language is much more, I don't want to say modern. It's just a little more down to earth and practical for what tournament players are going to experience.
I mean, I guess to extreme, I said, if you want to learn about pawn play, let's go back to Philidor. But no one goes there. And again, it's again not to downplay them, but I think that the quality of a lot of these new books that have come out. No, to be clear, a lot of new books that have come out are no more than a database dump. But you look at some of the McFarlane books and the research that John Hilbert does, or Henry Renette does. I mean, they brought these players to life in ways that we never could. And you look at Glenn Skinner's book on Alekhine, which came out quite a while ago. I mean, the research and the quality just wasn't done back then. So you have better tooling, you have better access. And again, I think that I have several favorite writers. As I said, and you look at these researches, but like anything that Donaldson or Hilbert or Timon comes out, is going to be really high quality, and you're going to enjoy reading.
Yeah, and a lot of these books now they're putting online is basically an online version. They basically turn it into a Chessable course or, video version, something like that. So you have players now who are learning the game and doing well without even touching a chess book.
Yeah, no, it's so it was funny. I had dinner, I want to say about 4 years ago with, I think it was Ray Robson. I'm hoping I get the right person, and John Donaldson. And I don't think he ever read a book. We were talking about stuff, and, and it was just really interesting. But you're right. I think it's different. And, I think, my first book was How to Think Ahead in Chess by Horowitz. And I played his opening ideas in the beginning. But, nowadays, I think these are dated. And again, I don't want to say throw away your old books and they're not fun to read. But I think that people tend to romanticize older books when they recommend titles like, oh, you want to improve, look at this. I think some of these newer titles are just really, they're not as well known and they're not considered classics yet. But I think the quality is really high. Yeah,
I'm a big Silman guy. Like, I'm a huge Silman fan. And The Amateur's Mind is probably my favorite instructional book. But my first instructional book, when I first started to get serious about the game, when, I was at a point where I kind of knew how the pieces move, and pieces moved and not much more, it was The Complete Chess Course by Fred Reinfeld. It was like this big, thick, I think it was like 10 books in one. You probably heard of it. And, he has like a section called The 10 Bad Moves about like, not developing your pieces. I don't know if you recall that one, but that was like my first foray into like serious chess study.
So that book was a compilation of a bunch of individual mimeos that he wrote, about 35 mimeos. So not only do I have the book, I have all those mimeos as well. And so, yes, I do remember that. I think that, Fred Reinfeld gets a little bit of a bad rap because that's the other thing that people forget. People like Reinfeld, or I'll pick some more controversial people like Schiller or Keane. They do a lot of stuff that's not great, but they had to make a living doing chess. And chess, it's very hard. Nowadays there's, people can teach online, there's Zoom calls, so you can give lessons anywhere. And so I always respect people like Reinfeld or Chernev who had real love for chess and wanted to make it more popular for the common people. And people like, it used to be years ago, oh, it's a Reinfeld book, it can't be good. Or, or it's a Keen book, it can't be good. And again, a lot of Reinfeld books or Keen books are not good, but some are actually quite good. Keen's book on Nimzovich is fantastic. He did a book on his own games that is really good. His books on the modern and the Pirc, from the Bastard series are good. But these people had to make a living on chess. I think people forget the fact, it's easy to be a critic, but to have to love the game and try to make a living back then had to be very, very hard. And many of these people, there was no prize money. The USCF membership was zero, and so it was really hard. So I think that a lot of these older guys don't get the credit they deserve, and Reinfeld's one of them. I mean, he wrote some fantastic books. His book on Tarrasch, Nimzovich, and Botvinnik are all fantastic.
Now, you mentioned Schiller and a few others. You said they were controversial. Is that why is that? I'm curious if that's okay.
Sure. So it's really, so one of the famous book reviews of all time was Anthony Miles's book. I think it was a Schiller book he reviewed. He said utter crap. That was how he described the review and of the book. So I think that, Schiller and Keen and there could be others who published a lot of really poor books to help sell money. And they were trying to, basically be a factory. And so people like to say, all Schiller books or all Keen books are bad. And, Schiller loved the game, promoted the game. He was a 2300 player, and not all of his books are bad. Some of them are sloppy. They're typos. But I think that it's easy to bash Schiller and bash Keen. But again, they loved chess and they made a living in chess. But their books may not be the greatest. There are very few Schiller books that I'll recommend. But Schiller tried hard. He wrote a book. Bats for Chess Openings. He supposedly did a lot of the work, even though Kasparov's name's on there. But it's easy to bash players who mass produce books to try and make a living. But again, I respect people who try and make a living playing chess because it's hard, and even now it's hard. But back then, before, I think it's really hard. So I think it's easy to bash people and take them out of context. And people like Keen or Schiller, and again, I knew Schiller a little bit, not well, and I've never met Keen, but they seem like they have a passion for chess and love chess, and so you got to give them credit for that. Just like Reinfeld or Chernev are very easy. I remember reading one said, "Oh, how good can a Chernev book be?" Because the guy was barely a master, and I don't even think he was a master. But Chernev loved chess. If you read some of his books about instructive games, so I think that people have to understand the context of where it is and see the love of chess in the book, and not kind of be as partially critical at times.
Very fascinating. So Andy Ansel, 15,000 plus book collection, fascinating background, played 3 world champions. Really interesting story. I appreciate you coming on the podcast, Andy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure being here.
Absolutely. And for those of you listening at home, as always, we appreciate you tuning in, and I hope you win your next game. Have a great day, everybody.